everyone. We are back with another edition of the AC Milan podcast. We had left you last time kind of dangling with the view of the fifth derby of the year. And frankly, the events that happened after that, most of us were pretty down for some time. 5 derby losses in a year is very, very, very hard to digest. But things have turned around, or in a way, Milan are still top of the pile in a way. We are still unbeaten in Europe in a way. The glass is half full or half empty. One can look at it different ways, but let's look at how our panelists look at it. So, as always, I have Sam and Rajat with me. Let's start with the first topic. And let's start at the beginning, which is the derby. Such a pathetic loss, and essentially the reaction after that. What do you make of it, Sam? Do we have a does Simone Inzaghi have a hoodoo on Pioli? Why does Hakan Çalhanoğlu keeps winning these derbies?
Honestly, I don't know. I appreciate you glass half full, half empty sort of diatribe at the start. I'd thrown mine at the wall, so it was hard to sort of tell if there was any water left in at the end of that. But in terms of the Inzaghi Pioli thing, and I'll touch on that just a little bit before we get to the reaction, which as we were discussing off there was incredibly, almost somehow more disillusioning than the actual result itself. The Milan derby thing, it's that they've lost the last 5. They've won 2 in the last 10, and the last consecutive derby win during the season was in 2011, which is 12 years ago. I was 21 years old. I didn't have a degree yet. Like that's the last time that we won twice in one season. It's astonishing. My facial hair wasn't much better then, but that's the only thing that hasn't changed. The idea of Inzaghi over Pioli, the thing that particularly annoyed me was the fact that how easy Inter seemed to have worked out what the antidote to the Pioli system was, and they just enacted it. Like they scored 5 goals on 7 shots on target. 5 goals on 7 shots on target. They just waited for us and just turned us over. It was really a complete throttling from Inter. But the response afterwards, where Pioli refused to apologise, this is the same club where Fabio Capello apologised in the mid-90s for losing 5-0 to Roma. That mid-90s squad, he apologised on behalf of that to Berlusconi. I think that tells you a lot about the way that the club are seeing themselves currently. And I think it reveals a lot in terms of the sense that the club don't really see themselves as regular Scudetto contenders. I think that the vibe was that the 2021 Scudetto was not necessarily a fluke, but a happy accident. You know, Juventus combusted and Inter were probably the stronger team over the course of 38 games and fell apart. Whereas Milan kind of cobbled together a Scudetto run out of like Paolo Maldini's connections and all this type of stuff. And we struck gold with the likes of Tonali, Leao's development and Maignan. I actually don't think they ever really expected to win the league so soon. I think the vision was to be a contending club in the top 4 and then maybe eventually regularly contend for Scudetti down the road when the stadium was finished. And because the reaction to that does not seem to befit a club that has the expectations to have won that game. If you come out of that and there's no social media response, there's no public apology, there's no press conference, there's no we apologise on behalf of the fans who paid God knows how much and travelled from God knows where to see a game where it was essentially over by the 40-minute mark is really a shame and kind of shameful from the club's perspective. Obviously, Italian football as a whole has moved beyond largely, and thankfully, let's be honest, has moved largely beyond the crazy ownership, immediate sacking, the apologising to tifosi following games. That kind of side of the game has largely moved beyond Serie A at the moment. They are trying to enter the reality that most clubs around Europe seem to exist in, where the club is just a faceless corporate structure that is very different and abstract away from the club, and then the events on the pitch are almost seen in a completely different way away from that. And I think that's quite a disheartening in the sense that Milan fans should feel a sense of grievance that needs to be addressed by the club. And the attitude that Pioli takes, as far as I'm concerned, is a man that is completely secure in his job. This is a man that is not really concerned, I don't think, that he's ever really approaching the sack. That even after negative results in the previous years, Scaroni has came out and said there was no consideration of sacking Pioli. Pioli was under no stress whatsoever. Even after these kind of results, there isn't even the whisper of a rumor. I remember back in the Berlusconi days that they would lose like 2-1 to Sassuolo, and then the whole club would go into Berlusconi's house while he'd have like a therapy session with the players to figure out what was going on. I'm not saying that was particularly effective. I'm just saying that there seemed to be a greater level of concern about the players' individual performances than there are now. Now, obviously, we'll talk later about the health that the club is actually enduring at the moment, and maybe we should take our expectations with a pinch of salt in the sense that Milan right now are possibly going through, well, they are going through the best period in 15 years on and off the pitch. And maybe the club are just seeing a big picture approach that distances them from the day-to-day minutiae of being a football fan, that was horrendous, and I want somebody to apologise for it. But the club probably see the overall picture and think to themselves, well, were we going to win the Scudetto? Are we the favourite for it? Probably not. Are we still where we need to go? Are we moving forward? Yes. Is Pioli still a good coach for us? Are there better alternatives than him that would come to this club right now? No. And I think that comes to it. And it's almost, we're not used to that kind of very neutral, almost opinionless approach, that completely objective view of the football club. And that's disappointing in the macro sense following a result like that. But I guess if you look at a wider picture, I can kind of understand that really overall still the club is looking in a good state. It's just incredibly hard to swallow after a game like that.
Absolutely. And I think the players showed a lot more investment and involvement, dare I say, emotion in the game that followed the derby, which was the UCL opener against Newcastle. I remember in an earlier episode of our podcast, Debacle mentioned that this is a game that Milan have to win. It's a game that Milan absolutely have to win. And at least from an attitude perspective, the players went out there on the pitch wanting to win the game. And Newcastle are no pushovers. Shortly after the UCL opener, they went and thrashed Sheffield 8-0 just a few days ago. Last night, they dumped Manchester City out of the Carabao Cup. So they're not a team to be trifled with, but they came to San Siro completely overwhelmed. Eddie Howe took this very interesting, peculiar approach of not having his team train at the San Siro. He said it's just a football pitch. And I think they realized it's a lot more than that when they took the pitch and played against Milan. They were clearly intimidated, and Milan fortunately made the most of it, just couldn't convert the chances. But to give you a sense of the sheer disparity between the two sides on the pitch and the complete domination and authority that Milan imposed on Newcastle. Milan had an XG of close to 2 versus Newcastle, which was a 0.2 or 0.3. They were clearly creating a lot of better chances. They had 25 shots attempted. 32% of Milan's attempted shots were on target. Milan created 4 big chances versus Newcastle's 0. So it was a largely one-sided affair, but it's a real travesty that Milan couldn't convert this domination into 3 points, because PSG seem to be finding their groove right now, which was expected. They too had a whole bunch of new players joining the club, and now Luis Enrique is creating some chemistry within that squad. And unfortunately, PSG beat Dortmund. So in the next game, Milan traveled to Signal Iduna Park, where they have to play Dortmund, and Dortmund's going to be under pressure to try and win this game. And Milan simply must win that game to keep up their chances of qualifying, because post the game against Dortmund, Milan head into a double-header against PSG. So when you look at these games from the start, it became all the more important to convert that Newcastle game into a win. And if we are looking at the glass half full and half empty, Maybe the optimistic perspective here is Milan demonstrated the right attitude. They came out firing all cylinders. They showed a lot of self-respect and dignity after the absolute shellacking that they got a few days before at the derby. But now let's see how they shape up in Germany.
Yeah, it's a pattern. When it becomes a pattern, it's a very troublesome thing that whatever else you win, if you keep losing that derby, it doesn't help you at all in terms of securing your spot. The only thing that purely can say was that the four derbies that we played in the first half of the season, I mean last half of last season, there were various absentees. Tatarusanu was in goal for some of them. And the only thing that they can say about this one is that probably, there are too many people who has joined. And Tomori was absent. But so has too many people joined in the Inter team. So it's absolutely flabbergasting. And I could refer to what Sam you said, that they had 7 shots and scored 5 goals, which either shows that we were careless or that they were exceptionally lucky. Could be, somewhere in between. And that's where the glass half full and half empty comes in. The other thing that we probably need to look at is our medical team and how they are managing the players, because this is a very common thing that has kept on happening for the last 4-5 years. Every time the season starts, people fall like flies. Already we have Benacer, and now we have Rade Krunic with an injury also. Already Calabria has had a longish stint outside of the team because of injury. The derby, they couldn't play Kalulu because he was injured. Maignan is again injured. Theo had to rest out a game. What's happening? I mean, Rajat, what happens? Because I don't see this kind of an injury issue in any of the other big clubs which plays 3 or 4 tournaments. And clubs in England probably play more than 3 tournaments. Do they exercise too much? Or, do they exercise like not scientifically? What exactly is the reason?
Magnan's injuries are a little hard to understand. In the first season, he had a wrist injury. In the second season, he had a calf problem. The third season, which is the ongoing season, apparently it's cramps or it's exhaustion. It's hard to say. He's missed a couple of games already. With him, of course, there's a recurring trend. He becomes unavailable from the 8th game onwards. The first year, he was not available from the 8th game for a couple of weeks. In the second season, which was last season, he was not available from the 8th game for 15 games. And of course, as a club that's trying to be self-sufficient, we are obviously going to consider monetizing players to build the squad, to improve the squad. And as hard as it is to let go of, if not the best, but one of the best shot stoppers and ball-playing goalkeepers in the world, Maignan is 28, possibly has another 5-6 years in him. But if he's not going to be dependable, unfortunately, this time around, Milan have a reliable shot stopper in Sportiello, kind of kept us in the game against Newcastle, made some key saves since he's been playing between the sticks for Milan as well. A huge upgrade over Tatarusanu. With Maignan, I think questions will begin to be asked. If next summer someone comes looking for a goalkeeper, it most likely will end up being Chelsea. Milan might consider letting him go. He's also involved in some contract negotiation talks at the moment. As far as the others are concerned, it's very clear that Pioli has his favorites. He simply doesn't trust anyone at left back outside of Theo. I mean, last year he had the excuse of Fodebola Toure, but this year, albeit he's 17, Bartasaghi seems to be a reasonably able deputy. to step in when Theo is not available, but he still isn't given the necessary minutes to debutize in that role. So Theo simply has to keep playing. He said Adli has been remodeled into a number 6. We didn't get to see it until Krunic had to essentially call it a day and take a month off. Why is that the case? Why is Adli now being played when Krunic is injured if you have remodeled this player over the summer to be someone who can play in that position? And Pioli looks stupid. He looks silly now after Adli's performance against Cagliari, because he clearly can play in that role, especially against the more inferior oppositions. We'll know how he shapes up against Lazio and Dortmund later on this week. But Pioli just doesn't rotate his players well enough, is what my personal belief is. And I think it is the over-reliance and pretty much running players to the ground that's causing these injuries, which I think can be avoided if the players can be managed better, if their time can be managed better.
Sam, I think one of us at least had been crying hoarse, saying we need a DM, we need a CDM, we need a CDM. So many names were discussed. From last year, we were playing two at the center, 2 in the midfield. Now we're playing 3 in the midfield. They did bring in, 3 different midfielders. So the only 2 midfielders we retained from last year were Rade Krunic and Pobega. That is a statement. So first of all, do you agree that Yassin Adli is the 6?
I'm not sure if you can do that with regularity based on the play that he is right now. And I also don't think that we should be rushing to call him the next Mark van Bommel because he put a few passes together against a newly promoted side in Cagliari. Call me a traditionalist, but I'm not sure counting passes. Like I saw on Twitter a lot of like Yassin Musa had 21 out of 21 passes. I'm like, yeah, well, how many of those weren't 3 yards to the bloke, directly to the right of him? Let's talk about like how well he actually pushed forward. And I don't want to mean that, but I'm caught in 2 minds in the sense that this clearly shows that he can hang at a Serie A level and play lower Serie A sides and can rotate when Krunic isn't available. Does this mean that he's the future of the team in midfield? No. It just means that Milan now have a kind of depth where they can actually rotate the midfield in a way that they haven't been able to for some time. I want to counter his touch because I feel like I'm more of a Pioli defender than most on Twitter anymore. People are so quick to rush to call for his P45. I want to push a little bit back on what Raj has said. That I think if Yassin Adli has been converted over the course of the summer to be a better defensive midfield player, and he's getting his first start and the first real chance to rotate at the end of September, I don't necessarily think that that's a sign of Pioli's flaws as rotation. I really think this might have been the first real opportunity that he could have to start for full 90 minutes. And while we haven't seen him for, I think I saw it was 364 days, so a year essentially, before he last started at Hellas and got taken off after 45 minutes, he's clearly needed a little bit of coaching, a little bit of development. He came in young, he came in raw. All the players seem to really like him. If you look on all the social media stuff, they're all over his comments. He's in every video. I remember seeing him in videos like 6 months ago, thinking, why isn't he annoyed? Why isn't he like moody? Why isn't he bothered or perturbed by what's going on? And maybe he's aware that there's a plan in place for him that involves this kind of development. And that's me trying to be optimistic a little bit. I think this shows that when we play, for example, in a few over the next few weeks, obviously you know that the gauntlet is coming: Lazio, Dortmund, Genoa, PSG, and Napoli. I hope that Adli is starting against Genoa. That's what I'd like to see. I hope that Musa is starting against Genoa, and I hope that Okafor is starting against Genoa, and Chukwueze is starting against Genoa. And until I see a string of 2 or 3 performances that show that he's consistently able to perform at Serie A, I'm not going to crown him. And also, I'm not going to use him as a baseball bat to beat Pioli with, or to prop up my own pre-existing opinions of his coaching style, which I think, I'm not saying Raj is doing this. I don't think Raj is doing that at all. I think folks on Twitter use that, any excuse, to build up what they already thought about Pioli. It creates like a straw man kind of psychological argument where you already think he's a crap coach, and now you're just using the Adli thing as a way to excuse that. I'm reassured that he's able to show that he was able to play at the Serie A level after such a long time without doing that. I'm less enthused about Pobega's performance. He couldn't really string any complex kind of passes together. The strong running midfielder that I was promised that he was never really seemed to show that. And maybe it's a weakened comparison to follow someone like Ruben Loftus-Cheek, who just looks like a bull in the middle of Milan's midfield at the moment. But I was left a little bit cold. But the idea that we have 5 midfielders that you can now reasonably rely on, and then you add Benacer coming back moving forward, I think that's an overall net positive. And I'm excited to see what the future holds for Adli after I've now seen him actually compete at the Serie A level. I think Milan's hope is that in January and July they don't have to buy a defensive midfield and there's one in house, and that's my hope as well. We shall see if that bears out.
And the way I see it is essentially you should have six midfielders who could start any day, and then you have a joker in the pack like Pobega, who is homegrown, who doesn't necessarily need to play, but he brings in a lot of other qualities, like being the homegrown player. So ideally, there should have been, and with respect to Benacer, I don't know how long he'll be out. There is a AFCON, so having that CDM. I mean, I know that ship has sailed long back, so me ranting on and on doesn't add anything to that. But having that CDM here would have given clearly, 6 midfielders, first team midfielders plus Pobega to fill in any kind of situation at any point in time. That we are now able to do in the front three. So, for example, in the front three, you have Leao, Giroud, and Pulisic as your first three, and then you have the substitute 3 as Noah Okafor, Luka Jovic, and Samuel Chukwueze. And then you have the joker in the pack, Luka Romero. Luka Romero is the joker in the pack. So that guy fills in, your homegrown quota. He can play anywhere. Similarly, like Pobega, we could have had the same thing with a little bit of planning at the midfield level. And there were so many good CDMs, Serie A proven CDMs available for 10 or 12 million. Anyway, what's done is done. I do hope that Benacer comes back soon and provides that balance. Let's go to the next topic.
Just before you do, I think Sam asked a question as to whether Adli was passing sideways or not. So there are some numbers to indicate the kind of style of play that he was implementing. He was the second highest long-range passer in the squad over the course of the Cagliari game. The person who tried the most long passes was Florenzi, and it was then Adli. Everyone after that were in single-digit attempts. He was the third highest passer in medium-range passes. What's very interesting is he was the 7th highest passer in short passes, which means he wasn't really attempting to make short passes. There were a lot more players trying to make short passes. So his role was very clear yesterday. He was just punting the ball up front as much as possible, quite with a reasonably high accuracy. And he was also driving forward whenever he got the opportunity. I think there's a bit of a premature celebration of all of this, only because Cagliari played a deep block. And that's why I'm very curious to see how he plays against the Sarri side, which presses a little higher up, how he plays against Dortmund, who are also quite aggressive pressers. If he's going to be pressed, how is he going to react? So I think the expectation of having Adli as a screener of the defense is a little optimistic, although he was the highest tackling and shot blocking player on the pitch yesterday for Milan. We have to take into consideration this is Cagliari. But what you would expect from a Krunic, who very intelligently moves into a space vacated by another player, you won't see that by Adli. And I think the expectations we must have of Adli when he plays also is that he's more of a creative influence than a defensive influence. And that's why I'm very curious to see how he plays against the better sides.
Right. I think we have only seen like 55 minutes of Adli. We have been waiting for it for last year, a lot of us. And let's see what he does against Lazio, and then I think he'll play Dortmund match too. So we'll see how it goes. Coming to the next topic, which is slightly on the positive note, Milan are still on the tied for the top position even after that horrendous derby loss. Thanks mainly to Domenico Berardi, who's been having an outstanding, September, taking down big teams left, right, and center. I mean, I don't know what more he has to do to elicit a move out of Sassuolo to any of the big teams. I mean, this time I thought that he was going to Juventus. They didn't make that move. In early days, when if Milan was still under Silvio Berlusconi, and some players scored 4 goals against Milan or performed day in and day out in a match against Milan, Berlusconi would usually buy that player. That was the trend. But he keeps on beating Milan wherever. I mean, last season we lost 2-5 at home, and he was part of that team. I didn't know the fact that Berardi and Sassuolo has a equal stranglehold on our cousins at San Siro. So it seems Sassuolo has won more matches in San Siro versus Inter than Inter has won against Sassuolo, which is really, awesome for a team which came up only like 8-9 years ago from Serie B. But jokes aside, Sam, what do you make of the first month of so far? Milan are still top of the table. Milan are still unbeaten in Europe, like I said, whether you look at it half empty, half full. We still have one big match in September, which is Lazio. And then October, we have a lot of big matches. But irrespective of what happens in the Lazio match, do you give pass marks to Pioli?
Yeah, obviously the derby was a big red X in the loss column. But overall, I think if you've got to think back, when we were speaking over around August, what we expressed concerns with and what we talked about that were problems going into the season. We were worried about the over reliance on Giroud. We were worried about the Rade Krunic CDM issue. We were worried about the absence of a real right wing back. We were worried about defensive cover behind Tomori and the health of Kier and how Tior would develop. And we were worried about some of these purchases like Pulisic, and we were worried about how these guys would start to fit in. Now, I think largely a lot of those, at this early junction of the season, a lot of those concerns have been assuaged. I think that Okafor has established himself even briefly as a good counter nine to Giroud. I think we have established that Leao has enough around him, including Pulisic and Chukwueze, for Milan to be offensively really interesting. I think Rade Krunic has proven once again that he is incredibly valuable to Milan, despite what people on the internet might say about him. Clearly, after Cagliari, Adli might be establishing himself as a decent Krunic sort of vice captain underneath him and developing. That seems positive. My concerns about the defense, all of our concerns, specifically Raj actually, concerns about the defense going into September, those have been completely realised. Let alone what's going on behind Tomori in general appears to be a continuing issue. He had a great game against Newcastle, but he looked shaky at times against Cagliari as well, which was a bit of a concern. But as long as he keeps playing against the Champions League, Depabam's wish that he gets sold to Chelsea for 80 million might actually come true, regardless of how he performs in Italy. But looking at it overall, to answer in a very roundabout way, I would say that most of our concerns have actually been reassured a little bit. But it's with the caveat that the worst portion of the season is upcoming. I would say that overall, if we were grading Pioli, I would give him a B minus, and it was nearly a much higher grade aside from that debacle against Inter. But other than that, he rotated well so far. He has employed a system that has taken advantage of his new players. That shows that he's scouting them, he knows them, he's developing relationships with them. Most of Milan's signings appear to be playing well from the start, including Christian Pulisic, Ruben Loftus-Cheek, who appears to have turned to Lothar Matthäus since he landed in Italy. And the Chukwueze flashes of pace is exactly what you'd have wanted at this stage, considering his role in the squad. Rafa Leao, apart from the fact that he decided to back in against Newcastle, he's starting to look more like Eden Hazard, but from his Chelsea days rather than Eden Hazard during his Real Madrid ones. And everything seems to be moving in a relatively positive direction overall. When you couple that with the fact that Milan are now top of Serie A, which again, if I asked you guys, where should Milan be after a month? Nobody in this room would have said first. No one would have said that with a degree of certainty. We all said that let's go for third, fourth. We're way ahead of that. Let's make sure we can perform well in Europe without embarrassing ourselves in a tough group. So far, so good. And the financial stuff is a little bit of a boon as well. And fingers crossed the stadium comes together. I would say that September has been an overall positive month, just with one obviously particularly negative thing. But in 3 weeks, we could be doing another podcast where they've struggled against Dortmund and Juventus. And we're looking down the barrel of a Napoli side that's maybe pulling together. Although I want to pat myself on the back for the Rudy Garcia thing. I was right about that, wasn't he? He's horrendous as a football coach in Serie A. But that aside, we'll see this time next month. But so far, barring the Inter result, it's kind of gone exactly as we'd hoped, considering the change, considering the expectations, considering the squad.
Considering the matches ahead, Rajat, I think September. I think Sam has covered. In the matches ahead, in October we have Dortmund. We already talked about the double header with PSG. There's a match with Napoli. There's a match with Juventus. I think there would be matches with Atalanta and Fiorentina also maybe. Hang on. Genoa. Sorry, Genoa. That's it. So we have Dortmund, Genoa, and Genoa under Gilardino is not a throwaway. They drew 2-2 at Napoli. Juventus and Napoli. How do you see and after October, I think we'll have relatively easier teams. So how do you see our October? I mean, what do you expect our October performance should minimum be so that Milan remains in the hunt for both Europe and domestic trophies?
As you rightly pointed out, I think there are very tricky games. You don't know which version of Juventus are going to turn up. They've been very Jekyll and Hyde this season, and unfortunately, Chiesa and Vlahovic are striking a very interesting partnership up front, and our Achilles heel is our defense. So am I as confident facing Juventus this season as I am perhaps in the previous seasons? Not so much. Napoli, if they're able to put out some more TikTok videos and unsettle Osimhen, then perhaps we can probably go into those games with some degree of assurance. But jokes aside, I am concerned about, I think Reticui has adapted to Serie A very, very well. The problem with all these teams are they have players who can score goals. And the problem with us is we have a defense that can't keep those goals out with any degree of certainty. More than Serie A, I'm actually perturbed with us in Champions League. For me, I think the next two games will largely determine our fate in the competition. If we end up going to Signal Iduna Park and we lose, and then we welcome PSG, I think we play them at home, if I'm not mistaken. No, actually, we travel to Parc des Princes. So both our games are away games, not easy by any stretch of imagination. And if we go to both these places and we lose these two games, we could be halfway through our group stage with 1 point on the board. and could also mean the end of our European journey. So I wouldn't really mind trading some not so impressive results in Serie A for some good results in Europe. If it means prioritizing the games against Dortmund and PSG while taking our foot off the gas in Serie A, that's okay, because it's still early days in Serie A. You can make up that in the long run. I think they say 10 games in the league is a good marker to know how you're fared and where you'd be going. And I think by the end of November, we would have completed easily 10 games of Serie A football. And as long as we're there and thereabouts of the first spot, maybe a 3 to maybe, if it's under 3 points, under 4 points from the first spot, I think that's something we should be able to grab with both hands, if that means we've put ourselves in a strong position to qualify from the Champions League.
That's more or less about looking forward to the Milan games. We hope we'll end September with a bang, with a home win against Lazio, who have been blowing hot and cold. They beat Lazio, they beat Napoli, but also lost to a whole host of teams. We are going to start a new feature, which is basically looking back at the performer of the month. Sam, who is your AC Milan performer of the month and why?
I think I hinted at it earlier, but it's got to be Ruben Loftus-Cheek. It's not just the individual performance of Ruben, who's come in and been really fantastic in every game that he's played. For Milan, obviously, aside from Inter. But that was a game where everyone else was bad as well. But it's the knock-on effect that it has on everybody else as well. He's defensively solid, but he drives forward and creates space for others. And he gets all these hockey assists where he's pushing forward leads to the attack that generates a chance down the road. And it's his ability to put pressure on the defense with light runs that create space for others. And we've talked a little bit about how the Milan left side on the opposite side of the field has become a real staple of their attack. Well, having Ruben on the other side pushing up allows the defense, forces the defense to spread out. It forces the defense to not be able to put as many resources into stopping Rafa and Theo on the other side, which obviously generates chances abound for Milan, especially against weaker opposition, who he seems to physically dominate. Second would have been Reinders for me, by the way, which shows that the Milanese midfield additions have been really, really positive in the summer. So it's Ruben Loftus-Cheek for me.
I would also go for Reinders simply because I think he has been a constant in that midfield. He brings in certain qualities which were missing. Maybe if a fully fit Benacer comes back, him and Reinders and Ruben Loftus-Cheek will probably be the best midfield in Serie A. I mean, I dare say. But yeah, Rajat, who has been your performer of the month so far?
Maybe slightly controversial. I think Arrigo Sacchi won't agree with me, given his scathing remarks on this player. And obviously the Italian media going after him and comparing him with Balotelli. So, Ms. Rafael Leao, prior to the game against Cagliari, Rafael Leao essentially contributed to half the goals that Milan scored, with 5 goal contributions. That percentage, of course, is now dropped to 40 after Milan scored 3 goals without Leao's intervention. And while I was a bit afraid of the over-reliance on Leao, because you don't want a player contributing half the goals to your team, especially when you've invested in attackers and 3 attackers to come into your squad. Actually 4. If you add Romero, it's 5. You've brought in 4 to 5 new attackers into the squad, and if one player is actually contributing 50% of those goals, and he existed in your team before you brought in these players, that's not a good look. But I think the Cagliari game just gives us some confidence that Leao can take a break. There are players who can chip in with goals, players who can acclimatize. I think Chukwueze yesterday could have had 2 assists if not for Ruben Loftus-Cheek bundling on the ball. So very, very positive from an attacking perspective, but I think Liao has been a standout for me. And if he continues on this trajectory, he can quite easily get to 20, 25, maybe even 30 goal contributions by the end of the season.
I should expect that. I mean, I had put a target of 20 goals and 20 assists for him. If Milan does go deep in UCL again, he could achieve that 20 goal and 20 assist target. But anyway, that brings us close to this edition of AC Milan podcast. Hope you have subscribed to the channel. If you haven't, please go ahead and subscribe, and do click the bell button so that whenever there is a new episode in, you will be notified of that. If you have any suggestions for us, we are available on Twitter, me at @Rossoneri, Sam at @Sam Calcio, and Rajat at @Rajat Kumar. Podcast Twitter ID is at AC Milan Pod. And you can also connect with us on Facebook and Instagram. For now, let's close this. Hope we have a great finish to the month and a positive result in Germany.